Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. My guest for this episode is Mike Robbins, who is a New York Times bestselling author of 5 books, including his latest, We're All in This Together. He is a sought-after speaker and consultant who delivers programs for some of the top organizations in the world. In this episode, we discuss how important it is to focus on the things that really matter if you want to live a life of significance. We also explore the transformative power of forgiving others and not holding grudges. And we unpack the statement that a bad day for the ego is a good day for the soul. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program again, Mike.
Thanks, Charles. Appreciate you having me back. Always good to connect with you and the audience and the whole IMS community.
So my first question really to you is, why do you think we get so distracted these days and not really focus on the things that truly matter?
Well, I think that's been an issue for a while, and I think it seems to be exacerbated by the pace of life, the expectation, the intensity of things. Even though life did kind of slow down in a weird way a number of years ago with the pandemic, there seems to be, as we're sort of in this post pandemic world, I talk to people all the time. I'm sure you do as well, Charles, that it just feels like now I'm expected to like be at work and be online and respond to everything and be working at all hours of the day. And again, it's not like we weren't doing that 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It just seems like the expectations continue to intensify. And when that's the case, I know for me, like when I feel overwhelmed or overloaded, it's hard for me to prioritize. Like everything seems like it's, a sort of flashing red priority, which obviously isn't the case. So, again, not an excuse, but just a reality. I think the way that we work and the way that we live, especially in our Western culture, we're moving so fast that ironically we sort of respond to the urgent and sometimes forget about the important.
You're right. And we clutter our lives with so much stuff. We're so busy, we're overcommitted. One of my other guests said, we shouldn't think of being busy as a badge of honor, but as a mark of servitude, because that's really what it is. And we're information obsessed and we're not paying attention to the things that really matter. And I know that in one of your books, you gave a great story about your mom in her final days and how she was able to really surrender and really the lessons that you learned from that experience about what really truly matters in your life.
Yeah, when I wrote my book, Nothing Changes Until You Do, it came out a number of years ago, and it wasn't that long after my mom had passed away. And, when my mom was dying, she had lung cancer. It was awful, as anyone who's listening has been with anyone going through that experience, especially someone close to you, like a parent or, a spouse or someone that you love. And one of the things that I've learned, Charles, through my life and having lost both of my parents and my sister, unfortunately, is that sometimes when people are dying, and or definitely when we lose someone close to us, it does have a way, even in the midst of the pain and the sadness and the shock of it and all of it, to orient us around what does truly matter. And my mom, even in the midst of the pain that she was going through and the difficulty, actually was pretty coherent in those final days, thankfully, and was able to share some things. And I learned some things from her. I learned a lot of things from her throughout my life, but just really being able to, focus on the people and the things that matter, to really speak up and talk about the things that are most important to us. And I was reminded at that time, like I often am when I go through an experience where something major happens that takes my attention. We think we're so busy and we do clutter our lives up, as we were just talking about, but oftentimes when something like that happens, when someone's sick, when a tragedy happens, not that we ever want it to happen, but what it does usually remind us is that actually there are things more important than all the day-to-day busyness. I'm sure everyone listening has had some experience of you're at a funeral and you see someone who you've been trying to get together with for a long time, but you've just been too busy, and then someone dies and all of a sudden it's like, well, here we are. I guess we can get together. And again, it's kind of a weird silver lining to the sadness and the grief that we experience when we lose someone.
And you have 2 great lessons that I think really, I'd love to just kind of explore a little bit more is that say what you have to say. Don't hold things back. Too often we hold back because we're afraid of rejection, judgment, or alienation. And sometimes it's actually too late. And the other big lesson that I got from reading your book is forgive, right? A lot of people are grudge holders. They like to hold on to resentments.
Totally, and, you know, it's ironic that my mother actually helped remind me of that as she was dying, and my mom. I mean, if she were still here, I think she would be the first to admit, like, she was a big time grudge holder. Like, that's like I come from a long line of grudge holders, so I know a thing or two about this. But again, for all of us, if we catch ourselves holding grudges, and sometimes it can be really deep personal stuff, but I see this all the time, Charles, at work with teams that I work with and leaders that are really struggling. It's like, oh, well, what about partnering with that person? Well, no, you know, they screwed me over 5 years ago. And it's like, okay, I'm not excusing what they did, but are you going to really hang on to that thing, or you didn't like what they said, or you felt like they stabbed you in the back? And, you know, it's how do we deal with those conversations, those dynamics? Can we speak up? Can we address things? And again, forgiveness doesn't mean you're condoning things or letting people slide or letting people off the hook necessarily, whether it's at work or it's in life. Forgiving means, to your point, we actually choose to restore ourselves. So I'm not going to waste time and energy holding a grudge against that person, even if I don't particularly like them or I don't like what they did, or I feel like what they did was hurtful or painful or disrespectful. Right. And sometimes at work, even more so than, I mean, in life, unless it's a family member or we're at work and we have to work with the person, if someone really sort of does us wrong, we usually will disengage from that relationship. But there are a number of relationships in life. Again, think about our in laws, think about our family members. And then at work, it's like I talk to people all the time who want to keep moving up in their careers and be more senior leaders. I'm like, you're going to have to get really good at dealing with some people that you don't like or who do things that sometimes are going to upset you, and that's not meaning you're going to be a pushover, but what it does mean is you learn how to address things directly and you learn how to let things go. So you're not constantly like carrying sort of a sack of rocks around with you with all the grudges and all the ways that people have done you wrong, you know, because that is just part of life and part of leadership. Like stuff's going to happen.
Absolutely. And just by forgiving them doesn't mean you need to continue that relationship like you mentioned. You could choose not to engage with them moving forward, but it's still very valuable and worthwhile to forgive them. You may not forget it. You may not want to resume that relationship, but that forgiveness piece is essential.
You know, for sure. There's a mentor of mine named Dr. Fred Luskin who I met about 20 years ago, and he was a professor at Stanford. And he wrote a great book called Forgive for Good. And this was, gosh, I think the book came out in the late 90s. So it's been out for quite some time. But what was interesting about Fred's work when I first met him is he actually partnered at the time. I mean, this was 25 years ago, and he was doing some of this research with the medical school at Stanford. And nothing had been done up to this point in terms of forgiveness and the impact it had on the body. Now these types of studies and these things are much more ubiquitous and we see them all over the place. But Fred was really, his theory was, I think if we learn how to forgive better, it's better for our health. And they actually partnered with the medical school and did this long study. And they come to find out it was like holding a grudge is actually bad for our health. And we all sort of know this anecdotally. And it's tricky. And what Fred would often talk about is he said, look, we don't usually learn how to forgive. Forgiveness is often thought of as this spiritual thing. Maybe you learn about it at church or synagogue or, you know, and not that you can't learn it that way, but he looked at it from a very sort of secular way. Can we teach people psychological techniques that teach them how to more effectively forgive? And if so, what's the impact? And the fact of the matter, just like we know meditation is important for our health or exercise is important to our health or sleep or hydration, so is forgiveness. And so for anybody listening, again, if you have grudges that you're holding, this is not, I'm not judging you or shaming you. We all have these things. But the more able we are to let them go, the more able we are. And again, there's two ways to really deal with a grudge or an issue that we have with another human. We can deal with them directly all the way through until we work it out. And sometimes that works and it can be hard work and it can be messy. Sometimes it's not possible. Again, the person could be literally no longer living, right? Or the person could be someone that we don't work with or we're not around anymore. Or we've chosen, to your point, Charles, to disengage from that relationship. That's okay. We can still do the forgiveness work ourselves. And ultimately, we get to a point where we let it go for us so that we're not carrying it around because otherwise it's just going to be with us all the time and it's going to have a negative impact on us.
So another piece, really, if you want to live a great life and live a healthier life, is to deal with your ego. And I love the saying that you gave in that book is that remember that a bad day for the ego is a good day for the soul. Perhaps we can unpack that for our listeners.
Yeah. I mean, look, most of the time, if we have, you know, an ego bruise, if we can take a step back from it and not let the ego bruise just completely overwhelm us, that notion of a bad day for the ego is a good day for the soul. It's like, what can I learn from this? How can this make me better? How can this make me stronger? What can I, right? I mean, think of life, think of parenting, right? My wife and I have two teenage daughters. Like, I'm constantly making mistakes and putting my foot in my mouth with good intention, and or saying things that I like, good morning, and all of a sudden that's a problem, but that can be the case. But again, just navigating, and not to say that whether it's our teenage children or coworkers that we have that we might find difficult or whatever, but sometimes when we make a mistake, when something happens that doesn't we don't look good, we can actually learn from it. Right? I was speaking actually at an event just last week, and the conference was all about AI, and the client that brought me in, it's a customer event, and I was saying some things, and afterwards the CEO came up to me and he said, "Hey, just so you know, we don't use the word robot anymore. We use the word agent," right? Like, robot kind of scares people. So we're trying to figure out how we talk about AI. And I'm like, I'm like everybody else. I'm trying to learn about AI, but mostly I don't understand it. But again, just that, I was like a little embarrassed when he told me, but then I was really grateful that he did tell me, because again, it's like, you walk around with, mustard on the side of your mouth because you had something for lunch, and then no one tells you until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You realize, oh my gosh, I've been in like two other meetings and no one said anything. I would rather someone tell me. That's a little simple thing. But again, if we can sort of embrace failure, embrace times that maybe we make mistakes or we don't look good. I find this a lot, Charles, in conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are really sensitive and challenging and difficult. And for a variety of reasons, a bunch of us, especially people who look like me and you, don't necessarily want to engage in those conversations or are afraid to engage in those conversations. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I offend people? Not that we ever want to do that, but if we're willing to engage in some of those discussions, even if we make some mistakes or we get some feedback or we end up feeling a little embarrassed, usually what we'll get is to learn, to grow. And at the base level, I think one of the most important things for our soul, so to speak, is learning how to forgive ourselves, learning how to not operate and think we have to be perfect all the time. So sometimes when I really screw something up, and look, I don't like screwing things up, whether it was back in the day when I played baseball, like you and I are both former baseball players, or now when I'm up on stage speaking, or I'm parenting, or I'm podcasting, or whatever. It's embarrassing if I make a mistake, and I'd rather not. But when I do, I try to remember, at minimum, can I learn to forgive myself and be kinder to myself when I make mistakes? Because I don't want to operate just like 24/7 with hypervigilance, scared of making mistakes, because then we actually end up making more mistakes. But there's usually so much growth and so much learning, even when we fail or make a mistake or find ourselves embarrassed. And so if we can embrace that more, there's just more growth available to us.
You're right. Self-compassion is so critical. I love the question that you ask yourself after these to have it be more growth oriented. And instead of saying, why is this happening to me? Instead, just change that one word, right? Why is this happening for me?
Yeah, and that's a big one. I mean, I learned that a long time ago. My friend Brian said that to me when I was going through a really difficult time after my baseball career ended. I played pro baseball and then I got hurt. Got injured and had a series of surgeries, and then my life changed pretty significantly. I wasn't able to play baseball anymore, which was really hard. But, Brian said to me, if you change that one word in that question that we often ask ourselves when something bad happens or something hard happens, or big or small, why is this happening to me? Or why did this happen to us? If it's a team thing or a family thing, it's like, if you just shift it to why is it happening for me or for us, it doesn't magically make the circumstances easier. But what it does is it shifts us more into that growth mindset, that curiosity, that looking for the lesson, the growth opportunity, what we might be able to take from the situation, even if it's not ideal. I had an old baseball coach that used to say, you either win or you learn. And while I thought it was kind of corny when he would say it at the time, I realized, like, there's a lot of wisdom in that. There's a lot of truth in that. And if we miss the lesson in the loss, whatever the loss is, then we sort of lose twice.
I love that. You definitely, yeah, great analogy. I love also a quote you bring in the book with Randy Pausch from the last lecture, his famous last lecture at Carnegie Mellon is he said, experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted. And it's a great way to frame it as well.
Totally. I mean, that's how we learn, right? Again, in the moment, it's hard. When we don't get what we want, most of us, myself included, are not usually happy about that. But that's how we learn. That's how we gain experience. That's how we gain wisdom. That's how we gain perspective. That's how we can learn to operate with more resilience, with more of what they call anti-fragility. And I wonder about this a lot of times too these days, Charles, as we're raising teenagers, and I think about the world in which we operate. on the one hand, I think we're so much more mindful of lots of things that are great. Conversations like this one, we're talking about self-compassion. We're talking about, how we can be kinder to ourselves. We're talking these days much more about aspects of, DE&I, as I was mentioning earlier, or mental health, or all these things. And it also sometimes it seems to me like we've gotten so fragile too as a society with how we raise our kids and how we talk about things. It's like people, and on the one hand, I don't mean this to sound sort of judgmental as much as just like how can we all operate with more of that anti-fragility, meaning like that core strength. And again, some of it is if we weren't so afraid to fail or we weren't so afraid to make mistakes or to screw things up, which again, most of us don't like to do, but that's part of it. Again, you and I come from a funny sport in baseball where there's so much failure, right? Like the best team in the major leagues this year is going to lose at least a third of their games. Most likely many more than that. Like the team that wins the World Series sometimes may only win like 90 or 95 games in the regular season, and there's 162 games. That means they could lose like 60 or 70 games and still win the championship. So like you have to learn in life, and I'm grateful that I played baseball all those years. Even if you're listening and you're not a baseball fan, it's just like failing is actually it's not the opposite of success. It's part of success. But as a society, I think we don't think of it that way. And as humans, most of us are so afraid of failing that, like, we get paranoid about it. But it's like most of the highest achieving people that you meet have failed a ton. And that's one of the reasons why they achieve at such a high level.
You're absolutely right. And one of my other guests said that one of the worst things that can happen to young people up until they get into the workforce is to have a string of successes and experience no failure, because you don't have that resilience. You don't know what it's like. And then when it does happen, it usually cripples you. You don't have the necessary mental fortitude and other qualities that you need to keep moving forward. I mean, this is another cheesy quote, but I love Rocky. What he said, I think is so true in one of the films. There's so many of them, but it's not how hard you hit, it's how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. And I think a lot of successful people do that in life. I mean, everyone's going to take their knocks. Everyone's going to get beat down, but can you keep moving forward? Do you have that fortitude, that perseverance, that resilience?
Totally. I mean, look, it's the classic example of, the student who's the valedictorian and the top student in the school or whatever, fill in the blank. And then they go off to college or they go off to some other bigger place and they realize, oh, I'm just one of many now and I'm not the best. I mean, I experienced this myself both as a student and as an athlete growing up, and it's humbling, but it's important and it's part of the process. If we can embrace that, again, it's going to be uncomfortable wherever we find ourselves. I see this happen all the time in with our clients. It's like, a manager, senior manager, director, all of a sudden they get promoted and now they're a VP, or they've gotten this big new role, or I see this sometimes like a first time CEO who's wanted to be a CEO for like a decade and they finally get the opportunity. Then they realize, oh wow, it's lonely here, or it's hard here, I'm not used to this. And of course, that's going to be the case. You're not going to be used to it right away. It's like, when you learn how to drive a car. Our younger daughter, Rosie, is 15 and she's got her learner's permit. Like, as cocky as she might act behind the wheel, like she's just starting to learn how to drive. So, of course, it's going to be nerve wracking for her and for us as her parents. But like, fast forward 5 years, 10 years, like many of us, I'm not super paranoid when I'm in the car now as a 50-year-old man who's been driving for the last, 34 years. But like sometimes something will happen on the freeway and I'll have to go, whoa, hold on a second. Like I need to pay attention because this is serious. So I think sometimes we forget the importance again of that process of failing, that sort of beginner's mind, and the vulnerability of that, and allowing ourselves to just go, the more comfortable we are with being uncomfortable, the more willing we are to sort of get hit, as Rocky would say, not that we want to, the more likely we can succeed. But if we need to feel comfortable and confident all the time, we're going to stay in a very small space that we feel like we can control.
The other thing, if you want to really live a happy, fulfilled life and be successful, is you can't get in the trap of comparison. And these days, it's running rampant with social media feeds. We're trying to compare ourselves to other people's finished versions of their life. I love the quote from one of the books I read is that some people that look at these overnight successes and say, where did they come from? And there was this one article about Terry Fader, who's a famous ventriloquist now, and he's profiled, and I think he's at the Mirage in Las Vegas. And he said, it took me 20 years of hard work to become this overnight success. So we're comparing the unfinished versions of ourselves to the finished versions of these products, and we don't measure up.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, there's another saying I love is, we compare our insides to other people's outsides and they don't match, right? I mean, it's all they're all cliches. So many cliches are cliches because they're true, but it's like I forget who said it, but there's another quote that I love that comparison is the death of joy. And what ends up happening, I think, look, and to compare is normal. To compare is human. I mean, there's a developmental part of it when we're little. We compare ourselves to our siblings or our friends, and it's a way that we kind of know where we are in the world. We know how things, what we should be doing, and there's a healthy side of it, just like competition can be really healthy. If you and I compete against each other doing something, it's going to require us to kind of dig deeper and push a little harder, and right. But healthy competition is when we push each other so that we're the best versions of ourselves. Unhealthy competition when we root against each other. So when we compare ourselves to other people and do it in that healthy way of like, oh, I can be motivated by someone else. It's like being around a lot of really smart, talented, energetic people is going to have us be more engaged, right? I had a chance to spend some time with some friends of mine from college last week when I was in New York for an event, and it was great to see them. We went to a ball game, we had some fun. And again, it's easy to get into that, oh, we're all, we've known each other since we're 18, we're all 50 now, and we're kind of like, where are we at in life? But there's a healthy side to that where we can learn from each other and be motivated by each other. And then there's a really unhealthy dark side of that. And I find myself, I don't know how it is for you, but like I got to be careful when I'm scrolling on social media because if I'm in a bad state of mind or I'm feeling kind of down about myself and I start scrolling on Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn or any of them, and all of a sudden, oh, look at Charles. Oh, look at this person. Look at that. Whatever it is about their life, about their family, where their kids are off to school or babies being born or whatever the heck it is, right? It's like so easy to, instead of being excited for them, to immediately feel inferior because of whatever shortcoming we perceive we have relative to somebody else. And we don't really know, even the people we're close to, but especially the people we're just sort of randomly connected to on social media, we don't know what's really going on in their lives. And as open as people have a tendency to be, myself included, most people aren't really sharing a lot of the gnarly stuff that's going on behind the scenes. They're just sharing, like, I used to joke with my wife when our girls were little, like we'd share the photo from, the vacation where I finally got everyone together and smiling at Disneyland. They didn't see the like meltdowns that were happening. And like at one point, me going, this is supposed to be fun. This is the worst time ever, because that's not usually something that we'll share. But the more we can actually be real with each other about what's going on, the less likely we are to get into that trap of comparison.
Well, and the other thing too, I find a lot with, especially with leaders, right, is they have this limiting mindset where they feel like if you have more success, Mike, then that means less success for me. I can't share in your success because either I'm envious or jealous, or I just feel like you've taken away something for me, and that's just so limiting versus an expansive mindset. Because if you're only allowed to celebrate your own accomplishments, that life's not going to be very fulfilling. But if you're able and allowing yourself to celebrate other people's, what a great life, right? You can celebrate a lot more frequently and be happy for them, realizing it's not going to limit or diminish your success in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, look, I mean, all of us in life, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. We have egos. Um, of course, if you get, let's say you and I are both vying for the same job and you get it. Of course, I'm going to be disappointed. I mean, I wanted the job and you got it. Or we're both, some internal award that's happening or whatever the case may be. And this happens again, the further you go along in leadership, the less positions there are available, just practically speaking, the higher up in any organization, right? And sometimes we make decisions. You and I go for the same job, you get it, I don't. And maybe I decide, okay, I've been here for a number of years. I really wanted that job. Maybe I make a choice and I go somewhere else. That's life, right? But to your point, if we can challenge ourselves to really come from an abundant mindset, I try. Look, and again, I got an ego just like everybody else. I can get competitive. I can get, into that comparison trap. But I try when someone close to me has a big success, even if I'm honestly feeling a bit envious about it. I try to do a couple of things. Number one, I try to first of all, be real with myself. "Oh, I'm feeling envious. That person had that success. And let me see if I can deal with whatever that is inside myself. Because it's not about them, it's about me. Second thing I try to do is see if I can access a part in me that is genuinely grateful and proud of them and excited for them. Because usually multiple things can be true at the same time. I can simultaneously feel some envy and feel some gratitude and appreciation for you. Like, hey, congratulations. The third thing is I also try to use it as a motivator, because it's like if someone close to me has some big success, even if they've had it faster than me or I think they're better than or whatever, I will sometimes literally even say out loud to my wife or someone close to me, "Hey, that success is really close to me." So without it being all about me and being selfish, it's like if I know someone close who's had this great thing going on, I would love to experience that in my own life, in my business, in my whatever. If it's close to me, I can see it and it becomes real. You've heard so many stories of people like, famous actors or comedians or whatever. It was like when they finally met someone who was actually doing the thing they wanted to do for real, it made it real. And oh, I met this person. It was a friend of a friend of a friend. And they were actually a working actor in Hollywood. And when I met them, it was like, oh, then I thought that's possible for me. Or this person was actually making money doing this thing with their writing or their painting or their, I don't know what, you hear people in the creative arts or in the entertainment world talk about this a lot. I remember the first time I met an actual person who'd written a book, not just seen a book in a bookstore, but then they told me about I'm like, oh, wow, like real people actually get books published. I sat next to a woman on an airplane and she was telling me about writing her book and then speaking at conferences. And I was like, wow, that's super cool. So I say all of that because we can take the ego reaction of the comparison or the envy and actually turn it on its head and use it in a really positive way. But we have to be mindful of it.
Well, how about now? We talked about grudges, and that's one of the most destructive things you can have. But another destructive quality that's going to really lead to a less happy life and just make you more miserable. And I see this a lot with leaders is righteousness, because it's not possible to be right all the time. It's exhausting, it's stressful, it's no fun for us or others. What are some tips or ways in which we can become more real?
Well, look, I mean, the thing about self-righteousness, which I talk about a lot in my work, and I often, when I'm speaking to a group, either virtually or in person, I'll just say, how many of you, like me, have a lot of opinions? And I raise my hand, and then most people in the audience will raise their hand, and I'll say, how many of you, like me, think your opinions are right? And again, we all kind of laugh with that knowing laughter. Again, it's not a problem to have strong opinions. It's not a problem to be passionate. The problem is getting stuck in that self-righteous way of thinking. I'm right, and if I'm right and you don't agree with me, you're wrong. And again, debate, disagreement is really healthy, but self-righteousness is dangerous because it creates disconnection, separation, and we see it all over our society these days. And most of us don't like it. Most of us don't like interacting with other people who are being self-righteous. The challenge is when we're being self-righteous, we don't think we're being self-righteous. We just think we're right, and often to our own detriment in our personal relationships, in our professional relationships. I talk to leaders about this all the time. It's like you can't influence people from a place of self righteousness because the natural human response to self righteousness is defensiveness. And so, even when you are technically right, if you're being self righteous, the person, unless they 100% agree with you, they're going to get defensive. And now we're in an argument about the thing, and we're not really able to coach them or give them feedback or have healthy discussions. So, to your question about how we can be more real, one of the things we have to do is start to be more mindful and aware of our own self righteousness. Again, I'm not saying water down your opinion. I'm not saying don't believe what you believe strongly or be willing to speak up about it. Just have enough humility and enough self awareness to realize I might be wrong, or even if it's not a right wrong thing, it's more of a subjective kind of values thing. Can I at least acknowledge maybe there's another way to look at this thing that I can't currently see, which is always true. So just those questions start to move us in the direction more of authenticity, of being more real. And again, some of us are going to be really passionate, outspoken, opinionated people because that's just kind of how we're wired. That's okay as long as we don't cross over that invisible line to that place of self righteousness. Because as soon as we do that, it doesn't mean we're bad and wrong and evil. It just means we're human. But it does mean we're going to start to really disconnect from and push a lot of people away. And sometimes people don't even, I talk to leaders all the time. And if they're really honest with me, they're like, I don't know why some of the people on my team don't take my advice or my coaching, or why they're not listening to me, or how come I'm not having as much influence as I want to have with my peers or with my own manager or with the senior leaders. And I'll often say, it's probably because you're being self-righteous and you don't even know it.
Great advice. It's being more deliberate, more conscious, so you can get yourself out of that cycle that's been so habitual for so long that you can then course correct and choose a different approach. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.